So when we say test protocols, these usually include the specific instructions for palate cleansing, swallowing, and expectoration, all the instructions to panelists, and the randomization and blind labeling requirements. So when you are required in the lab to construct your test protocols for each exercise, it includes both the instructions to the panelists and the instructions to the analyst who will be handling the test execution. So there are specific ways to serve samples depending on how many samples you have, what test you have to do, and so on. Uh, think of this as like the uniformity needed in, say, serving in a restaurant. No, the heating time, for example, and how you arrange them on a tray. If you have 100 panelists and you have to do that the same 100 times. So for these examples, you can see here that there are specific ways to arrange the stuff you need on a tray along with the score sheet or instruction sheet for the panelist. Some tests would require that you serve samples one by one, while others that utilize comparison require that the samples be served in sets together. So when you have serving protocols, these are the things that you usually take into consideration. The physical characteristics of your sample, especially if you want to make them as uniform as possible. Like, for example, you're scooping ice cream, then they have to look the same. Or if it's serving, let's say, potato chips, you want them to have an equal ratio of the brokens and the whole parts, or if you only want the whole parts, depending on what um, you intend to do for the test. So you have to consider whether it's going to be served hot or cold, but you have to be very specific. If you say serving temperature, then have a range for it. Like the coffee should be served at around 45 to 55 degrees. Then specify it and have a way of measuring that temperature. Okay, if you have serving containers, they should obviously be the same all throughout the test, whether they be reusable or disposable. It should be of one color for all panelists. When we say carrier, this refers to the things that are normally eaten with your sample. Let's say if you're doing a sensory evaluation for peanut butter, you don't just give them peanut butter without, say, a slice of bread or a cracker, since usually you don't like use peanut butter on its own. It's a spread for breads or other starchy carbohydrate-rich products. But you have to consider that the carrier is supposed to be more or less neutral, and it's not supposed to mask or enhance any deficiency in the sample being evaluated. Then we need instructions on how to rinse the mouth. Is it with water? Is it with a palate cleanser that's needed to remove other things? Like, let's say when you have spicy food in between samples, you can't just drink water because that won't remove the spicy feeling in your mouth. You need something like milk or fatty food, or sometimes you can use other palate cleansers like apples, depending on your sample. And then the spit or swallow or expectorate or swallow is a procedure that needs to be clarified on a case-to-case basis depending on the sample and the objectives. There are times when swallowing is better if you need to evaluate certain aspects of the food that can only be evaluated during the swallowing process, like, let's say, the fizz of a soft drink and how it goes down your throat, among other things. Or there's also part of the test protocol is numbering the samples with a random 3-digit code. Okay, sample size refers to how much sample is given. So it's either by weight or by volume, or sometimes number of pieces. And you have to strike a balance between the test objectives. Like, for example, you're going to be evaluating a burger. So would it affect their evaluation if you serve half or a quarter of a burger, and therefore they need to evaluate the whole big thing regardless? Or sometimes if it's let's say a juice product, you want to know how much will they be likely consuming to answer the question. Of course, they can always ask for seconds if um, they consume the sample without answering all of the questions you asked. So with sustainability in mind, we want the least amount of sample to meet the test objectives, but at the same time, we have to be generous enough and not feel like we're scrimping out. Of course, there are times when a whole piece of the sample is needed depending on the objectives. Like if you want them to experience how to peel a mango because that's part of what you want to test, like the peelability, then you'd have to give them a whole mango of considerably decent size. Okay, on the other hand, it would be such a waste to give, let's say, 170 grams of potato chips if you're asking them one single question. As a general rule, we want to keep hot colds hot and cold foods cold at the proper temperatures. We're looking at ice cream and coffee and soups here, now, for example. Again, the temperature of the samples across time and panelists should be the same. So whether you're serving it at 8 in the morning or at 4 in the afternoon, then it should be within a certain range. Okay. You usually use sample warmers for most hot food, or keeping other samples properly tempered. Like let's say when you have ice cream, you don't want to serve it too cold that you break the wooden spoon that comes with consuming it. Right? You want to temper it at maybe a refrigerated temperature and serve it at pretty much the same temperature. Samples are usually heated to enhance the flavors and to have them perceive it at the proper temperature at which they are normally consumed. And generally, we'd want to make sure that these samples are safe for consumption. So if you're putting them into the temperature danger zone, then make sure that they are there for the least amount of time. We want to take note of how fast foods do it, since they prepare samples, their food rather, on a on an in-demand basis, and they have to do it fast and they have to do it consistently, and they put limits on their sample holding time. Like for example, if you determine the holding time to be 10 minutes, if a sample is not consumed after 10 minutes, then it must no longer be served to the panelists for both quality and safety issues. So generally, as we want to be sustainable, we'd want to use reusable containers as much as possible, although we have to weigh the pros and cons of how much time it will take to wash them and how much manpower we do have, and if it's disposable, is it something that can be recycled, or will it just add up to the pollution of our landfills. But generally, we don't want things to affect the properties of the sample. Generally, we choose white or sometimes with transparent case covers on top. But the rule of thumb here is we don't want to affect the perception of the sample. We want the sample containers to be uniform. And if there are labels, these labels should not affect the sensory properties of the sample or should not impede the panelist evaluation of that sample, such as in using marking pens that have strong aromas or odors. So the choice of using carriers is somewhat arbitrary and entirely up to the analyst, depending on what their objective is. So usually we want to strike a balance between realism, okay, and at the same time you want to minimize the ability to see differences that do not exist and are only brought about by the carriers themselves. Okay, what foods do normally require carriers? As I mentioned earlier, spreads and anything that you perhaps put on a sandwich. For example, if you have a pasta sauce, then you would have some neutral tasting pasta that should go with it. But the pasta shouldn't be so good that they would affect the evaluation of the sauce altogether. Or if you have a viand ulam, then you'd probably want to serve it with some sort of plain rice. So palate cleansing refers to in between samples, the use of anything that could remove the residual materials from previous samples, and ideally they shouldn't contaminate your mouth with more residual material from the cleanser itself. You usually use water and table crackers or saltine crackers, sky flakes, magic flakes, and the like. uh, for sweet and bitter stimuli. For fatty foods, we could use warm water to dissolve the fat or some crackers to absorb that fat. For wines, we have pectin or carboxymethyl cellulose solutions. For spicy or hot and spicy products, we can use crackers, water, and milk. And for those with cooling stimuli, like mints and the like, could use chocolate crackers, carrots, cucumber yogurts, and sorbet. Generally, you want crackers and water as well for other non-lingering products. But of course, one disadvantage of using calorified or calorie-containing palate cleansers is that, of course, you'd increase your caloric intake because these are usually swallowed. So expectoration is the more dignified term for spitting, but this is basically spit or swallow. Most tests require samples to be expectorated. This is to um, prevent satiety prematurely because when you're full, you perceive some samples differently, especially if you're having a lot of samples to test over the period of the evaluation. There's less carryover as well, and or influencing the perception of the next product. And of course, if you have very high fat products, then you could actually, of course, get fat by swallowing too much. Generally, though, when you are doing consumer tests, to aid in natural consumer perception, you ask the consumers to swallow, and they're also more or less grossed out by expectorating solid food samples. And again, as I mentioned before, when you swallow, you get the perceptions associated with swallowing the food, such as the the texture or mouthfeel as it passes through the throat and how it feels to eat certain food. Like for example, when you have spicy food, of course, swallowing that food may produce more sensations that wouldn't normally be produced when you expectorate it. One of the things we have to nitpick about are the instructions to panelists. They have to be as short as possible, as idiot proof as possible, and then you have to deliver it verbally before the test starts, and whatever you say, it also has to be written in the score sheet with no room for misinterpretation. Usually you want to pre-test this by having a non-sensory evaluation student um, read and check if they comprehend or understand what you have written. So here's an example of instructions for panelists in a descriptive sensory evaluation. So take note that the score sheets contain the reference samples, and they even give you the actual technique that you are supposed to uniformly do together to evaluate the sample. So in this case, they're supposed to taste the references and calibrate themselves. So if you're tasting water, that's supposed to indicate that it's a 0 on the scale. Then the first start solution is 75% turbidity, and 0.1% start solution is 150%, or rather 150 points for turbidity. So as you can see, instructions for panelists have to be very specific. And of course, they would have to depend on whether or not your panelists are trained or untrained. In the case of descriptive sensory evaluation, we assume that the panelists are trained or are undergoing training. Therefore, you can be more specific with your instructions. So unlike what we usually see in advertisements wherein brands are assigned with a letter like brand X, brand Y, the other brand. In sensory evaluation, we want to eliminate the bias associated with such labeling, and therefore we use 3-digit codes in place of, let's say, letters. However, we take note that we want to avoid bias as much as possible. So we also actively called out 3-digit codes that may have cultural meaning. For example, in our case, 666, 777, or 888 might unduly bias superstitious individuals regarding the nature of the sample. And usually we use random number generators to generate these random codes. And sometimes we use maybe 1 or 2 random codes per sample, because using a totally randomized code for each person and for each sample would result in a very, very messy um, score sheet when it's time for checking.